Alright, in this next unit of the course we're looking at a big metaphysical question. We're looking at what has come to be known as the external world problem. The problem of how we should understand the relation between the mind on the one hand and the world on the other hand. There's no question but that our mental states represent the world and represent the world as being various ways. Excuse me, our mental states represent the world as having colors, as having tactile properties like hard and soft, and hot and cold, and rough and smooth. Our mental states represent the world as having sounds, having smells, having tastes, all the sensible properties by which the mind represents the world. Our mind represents the object's experience as if they were mind-independent, persisting objects that do not depend on our perception of them or our awareness of them to continue existing. There's no question but that our mind represents the world as being all these ways, as having these properties and being all these ways. But there's a question of how accurately, how confident we can be that the way our mind represents the world is the way that it is. Is the way that our mind represents the world just exactly the way that it is? Or is there reason to suspect that maybe reality is quite different from the way we experience it? Or maybe it's different to some degree. There's a spectrum of views that one can take on this issue. One position on the spectrum would be that in some respects the mind's representation of the world, our mental states represent the world in some respects accurately, but in other respects not really the way that it is. There's good reason to suspect that some of the ways the mind represents the world as being are accurate. We can be confident in the correctness of our judgments, the correctness of those representations. The mind really does represent the way that the world is. But then maybe in certain other respects, the properties of that mental representation of the world are really just in us. That's one possibility. Another possibility is reality is quite different from the way that the mind represents it. How confident can we be that the way the mind represents the world is the way that it is? Very confident, not so much, some moderate view, some intermediate view. In some respects, the mind's picture of the world is accurate, in other respects, not. There's no simple answer to this question, and we'll look at here again a spectrum of views. We'll look at a range of positions that you can take on this issue. What should we think about the relation between the mind and the world? The way that the mind represents the world as being on the one hand, and the way that it is. Is there perhaps a gap between those two? One can think of reasons for suspecting that there might be. At any rate, we'll consider a range of views that one can take on this issue of the relation between the mind and the world. It's come to be known in philosophy of mind and metaphysics as the external world problem, the problem of how we should understand the relation between the mind and the world. Here's one way that you might think of the problem by way of a kind of analogy. Imagine someone who, for whatever reason, has lived her whole life in a room and has no direct access to the outside world, to the world outside the room. But she does have a TV, she does have a television. And the images on the television screen are representations of the world outside of the room. Now, some of those representations on the television are presumably accurate representations of the way that the world is outside the room. Maybe documentaries or maybe the news are roughly accurate representations of the way that the world is outside of the room. Other representations, movies like Shrek, cartoons, fantasy stories, fictional shows, what have you, are maybe not accurate representations of the world outside the room. A movie about ogres and talking donkeys, say for example like Shrek, would not be an accurate representation of the world outside the room. But of course the dilemma for the person inside the room is that since she can't step out of the room, since the television, the images, the representations of the world on the television screen are all that she has to go on, she can't know which of those images are accurate because there's no way to compare the images with the outside world. If she can't step outside the room and compare the images on the TV screen to her experiences in the actual world, then there's no way to know which of those representations of the world are correct, which of them are basically accurate, which of them are entirely fanciful or imaginary or have no connection to the reality, or only a very slight connection to the reality outside of the world. That's the dilemma that the person in the room is in. Well, the problem is, here again, I started out saying that our mental states are representations of the world. Our mind represents the world as being various ways. But just as the person inside the room can't step outside the room to compare the images on the television screen with the world outside the room, we're in the same dilemma. Similarly, we cannot step outside of our mind's representations of the world to compare the representations on the one hand and the world itself on the other hand. We only know of the world by way of the mind's representations of it. So we're in the same dilemma as that person inside the room. Maybe some of the ways that our mind represents the world as being are accurate. Maybe some of them are not. Maybe none of them are. What should we think about this relation between our mental states and the ways that our mind represents the world on the one hand and the world itself? Are there reasons to be confident that our mind shows us the way that the world really is? Or is there reason to be skeptical? Is there reason to doubt that the world is anything like the way our mind represents it as being? Could a reality be quite different from the way that we experience it, or from the way that the mind represents it as being? Are there reasons to suspect that that is the case? That's the issue that we're going to get into in this unit of the course. The classic work is Descartes' Meditations. The 17th century French philosopher kind of set the agenda for discussion of this issue, at least in modern times. And it's important to understand something about the broader intellectual context, the broader philosophical and historical background. Of course, Descartes is writing in the context of the scientific revolution. And in the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, an awful lot of traditional beliefs were overturned in a relatively short time. It was a period of intellectual and cultural tumult, of upheaval. Many ideas, many beliefs that had been thought well established, many beliefs that had just been thought of as simply common sense, were overturned relatively quickly by the scientific revolution. Of course, the belief that the Earth was at the center of the universe, the traditional old Ptolemaic and Aristotelian view, was overturned by the new Copernican view, according to which the sun is at the center of our planetary system, and the apparent motion of the sun around us in the course of a day and night, that apparent motion of the sun around us is actually produced by our motion on the Earth's axis, the Earth's daily motion, diurnal motion. So, such beliefs as the belief that the sun moves around us, that had seemed to be well established for a long, long time, had been believed for most of human history, were overturned relatively quickly. The belief of the old Aristotelian science that heavier bodies fall faster than relatively lighter bodies was overturned. Galileo discovered that all bodies accelerate at the same rate, independent of their weight. So all these discoveries and lots of others you can think of, I'm sure, in the course of the scientific revolution, all these discoveries by people like Copernicus, Kepler's discovery that the planetary orbits were actually elliptical, not circular. So Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Copernicus's new model of the planetary system, Galileo's discoveries in mechanics, what we call physics today, Newton's discoveries. This was a period of intellectual upheaval, intellectual tumult, it was a chaotic time, intellectually speaking, because an awful lot of beliefs that had seemed well established for a long, long time were all of a sudden overturned. And so Descartes begins the meditations by reflecting on this state of affairs. He says, so many things that I believed at one time or another in my life turned out to be false. And given this fact, can I be confident that anything that I believe is true? An awful lot of things that had seemed true turned out not to be the case. So with respect to the beliefs that I have now, what confidence can I have that those beliefs are true? So what Descartes proposes to do in the meditations is to begin over again, to make a fresh start, to start from scratch, to begin over again the task of building up the arch of human knowledge from new foundations. Descartes says, I realized that once in my life I had to raise everything to the ground. That is to say, tear down all the old structures of belief. I had to raise everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundations if I wanted to establish anything firm and lasting. So Descartes wants to start over again, start from scratch, begin anew the task of laying the foundations for human knowledge. So here's one possible position that you can take on the spectrum of views, here again with respect to the external world problem. I'm just going to mention it now as one end of the spectrum, and then we'll come back to it a little bit later in this unit of the course. One possibility would be the idealist position. It's also known as phenomenalism. Idealism, phenomenalism, the position developed by the British empiricist philosopher, 18th century empiricist George Berkeley, who, with respect to the physical world, with respect to the physical objects around us, said that in Latin, esse est percipi, that is to say, to exist is to be perceived. The familiar objects of our experience, the mundane objects in the physical world around us, like desks and chairs, houses, trees, these things do not exist outside of perception. That is the idealist view. Berkeley's view will be that to exist is to be perceived, and the world is composed of mental things, namely ideas. The thesis would be that there is no world external to the mental world, and thus there's no external world problem. One possibility, one possible approach to this issue of what to think of the relation between the mind and the world is simply to identify the two, simply say that the world is a mental phenomenon. The world is composed of the perceptions that exist in minds. That would be one possibility. And so with respect to the ways that the mind represents the world as being, the mind represents the world as having colors. The mind represents the world as having sounds and smells and tastes and tactile properties like hard and soft and hot and cold and rough and smooth. The idealist position would be that all of those sensible properties, things like colors, for example, don't exist outside of minds. But the view would be that the world is the way that the mind represents it as being. Therefore, it's a logical consequence, according to Berkeley, that the world is a mental phenomenon. The world is a collection of ideas. So that's one possible position that one can take on this issue of the external world problem, the problem of what to think of the relation between the mind and the world. That would be one end of the spectrum. We're going to start off with Descartes' more moderate position on the spectrum of views. Descartes would fall in the middle. He would defend a kind of realism, and what is meant in this context by realism is that a mind-independent world is real. A world that exists external to mind is a real thing. There is a mind-independent world of material substances. Substances that do not depend on minds for their existence. So that would be the realist view by way of contrast with the idealist view. And then Descartes' particular version of realism has come to be known as indirect realism. So again, the realism part means that there is a mind-independent world of material substances. But the indirect part of that means we only get at it very indirectly. In some respects, the mind's representation of the world is accurate. But an awful lot of what is in the mind, an awful lot of what is in the mind's representation of the world is actually just in us. So that would be the indirect realist view. A mind-independent world of material substances, a world external to mind, is something real, but we get at it only very indirectly. So that would be a more moderate position, more of an intermediate position on the spectrum of views that you could take. And then at one end of the spectrum, the opposite end from idealism would be direct realism, which is a view that has something in common with Descartes' view, indirect realism. The direct realist view would be, here again, a world external to mind, a mind-independent world of material substances, is something real. And proponents of direct realism, like Thomas Reid, we'll take a look at some selections from Reid later in this unit of the course. A direct realist argues that the world is, that mind-independent world external to mind, is the way that the mind represents it as being. So this is the spectrum of views that you can take on this issue. We're starting off with Descartes' defense of indirect realism. Again, we'll spend some time considering what there is to say on behalf of idealism as well. Let me come back now, though, to this issue about the intellectual context of Descartes' project. So here again, in his time, in the era of scientific revolution, again, it was a chaotic era, intellectually speaking, a period of tumult, period of upheaval. Many traditional beliefs were overturned relatively quickly, in relatively quick succession. And Descartes begins the meditations by posing this question: what confidence can I have that any of my beliefs are true? So many beliefs that seemed well-founded in the past turned out not to be true. So what confidence can I have that the beliefs that I have now won't similarly be overturned? So many of my beliefs ended up being on a very shaky foundation that crumbled relatively quickly in the light of the new scientific discoveries. How do I know that isn't true with respect to the beliefs that I have now as well? So this is an epistemological issue that we're getting into, as well as a metaphysical issue. There's this metaphysical question, what to think of the relation between the mind and the world. And there's this epistemological question, what confidence can we have that our beliefs are true? That is to say, what confidence can we have that our beliefs are knowledge? One position that you can take in epistemology, the branch of philosophy here again that deals with knowledge, one approach that you can take to the issue of knowledge is this position that Descartes develops in the Meditations, known as foundationalism. Foundationalism is the position in epistemology according to which our knowledge is based on a number of indubitable, certain beliefs. And on the basis of these foundational beliefs, we build the superstructure of our knowledge. So this is Descartes' project in the Meditations. Part of his project is to identify beliefs that can serve as foundational beliefs, beliefs that are indubitable. That is to say, they cannot be doubted. They are certain. So how does he propose to identify those beliefs? Well, he adopts a method that has come to be known as the method of doubt. He starts off saying, I'm going to subject to doubt, with respect to all my beliefs, I'm going to subject them all to doubt, or I'm going to subject to doubt anything that could conceivably be doubted. I'm going to adopt in a hypothetical way a kind of radical skepticism. Let me hasten to add here that Descartes is not a skeptic. As I just said, he's a kind of realist. He's not a skeptic. He does believe that we have a certain amount of knowledge. But the method of doubt is a kind of philosophical method. Here again, Descartes begins from a position of radical skepticism because he wants to see what beliefs could survive this radical skeptical doubt. Any beliefs that could survive this initial position of radical skeptical doubt, subjecting to doubt everything that could conceivably be doubted, any beliefs that survive that test are going to serve as these foundational beliefs, these indubitable, certain first principles. So he proposes a series of skeptical hypotheses. They've come to be known in the literature on Descartes' Meditations as the 3 levels of skeptical doubt. He wants to come up with a radical skeptical hypothesis, that is to say, a skeptical hypothesis that would call into question everything, or nearly everything. And any beliefs that survive that most radical skeptical hypothesis that he can devise, those will be the indubitable, certain first principles. Those will be the foundational beliefs. So he begins talking about perceptual error. The first level of skeptical doubt is the problem of perceptual error. He observes that the senses are sometimes deceptive. We know that at least some of the time, the way that our senses represent the world is deceptive. The way that our senses represent the world is not the way that the world is. We can be confident of that because we're all acquainted with this phenomenon of perceptual error. So what would be some examples? Suppose you're standing on railroad tracks and you're looking at the horizon. At the horizon, the railroad tracks appear to converge. If you were just going off of what you see, you would believe that they do converge. They don't appear to continue running parallel to each other. They appear to come together in the distance. That's the way that your vision represents the world as being. Now, you know that the tracks continue to run parallel because you keep walking down the tracks, and then you get to the point where you had been standing, where you get to the point that you had been looking at earlier, and you see that the tracks don't converge at all. They continue to run parallel. So you know that the way that your mind represented the world in that instance was not the way that it was, on the basis of that later experience, that later perception. Or suppose you're driving on the road, especially in the summer, and there appears to be water up ahead on the road, and then you get to that point where you get to that point you had been looking at where it looked like there was water, and there isn't any water there. It was a kind of optical illusion, wasn't it? So again, the way that your mind represented the world was not the way that it actually was, you come to find out. Or maybe you've seen a straw half in and half out of a glass. It appears to be bent, and then you pull it out of the glass and you see that it isn't bent at all. It's perfectly straight. Or maybe you've seen a rod or a pole half in and out of a swimming pool, something like that. Same phenomenon, right? It appears to be bent, and then you pull it out and you find out that it's straight. It's not bent at all. Again, the way that the mind represents the world in that instance is not the way that it is. You come to find out on the basis of a later experience that that's not the way that you had initially thought it was. So we're all familiar with this phenomenon of perceptual error, optical illusions, things like that. Any kind of misjudgment of perception. You mishear, you don't hear correctly what is going on. Optical illusions. All kinds of perceptual errors. Lots of examples that you could think of. But the first level of skeptical doubt, the problem of perceptual error, proves not sufficiently radical for Descartes' purpose. It doesn't really call into question knowledge in general. Perceptual error does not generate skepticism about perceptual knowledge in general, for a couple of reasons that Descartes mentions. For one thing, we use perception to correct for perceptual error. So I just gave a few examples of that. It's a perceptual error to think that the railroad tracks converge at the horizon. That is the way your perception represents the world as being. So there is a kind of perceptual error involved. But then later, when you get to the point that you had been looking at earlier, that point on the horizon, and you see that they don't converge, they continue to run parallel, well, that too is a perception. So at time 2, you're using perception to correct the misperception that occurred at time 1. And the same is true in the other examples that I gave, right? At time 1, there appears to be water on the road up ahead of you. And then at time 2, you get to that point, and you see that there isn't any water there. You realize that the way your mind represented the world at time 1 was not accurate. But of course, at time 2, you're using perception to correct that misperception that occurred at time 1. Or again, the straw half in and out of the glass, half in and half out of the glass. At time 1, it appears to be bent. At time 2, when you take it out, you realize that it's not bent, it's straight. But here again, that is also a perception. At time 2, you're using perception to correct the misperception at time 1. So we use perception to correct for perceptual error. So that suggests that there is some measure of reliability to perception. The very notion of perceptual error, of course, the very notion of error presupposes a background of reliability. If some faculty were not reliable at all, then of course we wouldn't even have the concept of error in the first place. So the concept of error presupposes a framework of initial reliability. So here's another example of a perceptual error, the Muller-Lyer illusion, famous example in history of perceptual psychology. This line appears to be longer than this line, but actually the two lines are the same length. If you were to cover up the lines at the end of the line in each of these two instances, cover those up, you would see that the lines are actually of the same length. It doesn't appear that way, but here again, you could take a sheet of paper, cover up these lines at the end, and see that the lines are the same length. But of course, that would also be a kind of, here again, would also be a kind of perception. So you could use that later perception to correct your initial misperception. So we use perception to correct for perceptual error. It's also the case that we have a common sense distinction between normal perceptual conditions and conditions that are vulnerable to error, conditions that are liable to error. So we know, for instance, that vision is not reliable at great distances. We know that it's only reliable up to a certain point in terms of distance. We know that vision is not reliable in the dark. And you could say the same about our other senses as well. It's very easy to trip up our senses, isn't it? It's very easy to trip up our perceptual judgments. But in normal perceptual, but here again, the fact that we have this common sense distinction between normal perceptual conditions on the one hand and conditions in which we know we're apt to misjudge, that suggests that there is, here again, at least under normal perceptual conditions, some measure of reliability to perception. So the first level of skeptical doubt doesn't call knowledge into question in any serious way. It doesn't generate any serious skeptical worry. So Descartes moves up to a second level of skeptical doubt in what has come to be known as the dreaming hypothesis. So he reflects on the fact that he's sitting in his comfortable chair in front of the fire, and it all seems so concrete, it all seems so vivid, it all seems so immediate. He can feel the warmth of the fire, he can see it. He says he has a sheaf of papers on his lap, he can feel the weight of the papers. And it all seems so real, it all seems so vivid, so immediate, so concrete. How could I be wrong about this? How could I be wrong in thinking that my mind represents the world the way that it is, when it all seems so immediate and so vivid? But then he goes on to further reflect that oftentimes that has been the case, and actually he wasn't sitting in his chair in front of the fire at all. He had actually already gone to bed, and he was just dreaming. Maybe he had worked too late, and he was just dreaming that he was still sitting in his chair in front of the fire working. Well, now this is a more serious skeptical worry than the worry generated by perceptual error, right? Because now none of the ways that your mind represents the world as being, maybe I shouldn't say none, but in a much more serious way, in a much more extensive way, let me put the point that way. The way that your mind represents the world as being is not the way that it is. Because he thinks he's in his evening gown, but in reality he's actually lying naked in bed. He's already taken off his evening gown and gone to bed. But he's dreaming that he's in his evening gown, sitting in his comfortable chair in front of the fire. But that's not the way that it is. He's actually not wearing any clothes at all. He is actually not feeling the warmth of the fire. He's actually in bed. He's not seeing the fire. He's not feeling the weight of the sheaf of papers on his lap. None of that is true because he's only dreaming all those details of the scenario. He's only dreaming them. So now in a much more extensive way, in a much more worrisome way, the way that the mind represents the world is not the way that it is. It represents all these things as being the case, but in point of fact, he's asleep in bed dreaming all these things. So this raises a more serious skeptical worry. He says, let us assume then, for the sake of argument, that we are dreaming, and that such particulars as these are not true, that we are opening our eyes, moving our head, extending our hands. Perhaps we do not even have such hands or any body at all. Here again, sitting in his comfortable chair in front of the fire, he can extend his hands and see them. And here again, It seems so vivid, so concrete. How could you be wrong about such a basic, such a mundane perceptual belief as that you're looking at your hands? How could you be wrong about that? It seems so immediate, so vivid. It seems so concrete. How could you be wrong about that? But if you had lost your hands in a catastrophic accident and you were having a dream in which you were looking at your hands, if you were dreaming of the time before you lost your hands, then that's how the world would seem to you. It would seem to you just as it does seem to you now. It seems so immediate, so real to you now, but of course it would seem that way if you were dreaming it too. But if you're dreaming, then you don't know that the world is the way that your mind is representing it as being. So this is a more systematic skeptical problem, isn't it? There's a kind of extensive misrepresentation of the world. All these particulars are not true. It seems to you that you're opening your eyes, but if you're asleep in bed, actually you're not. It seems to you that you're moving your head, looking around, but if you're asleep in bed, you're not. It may seem to you that you're extending your hands and looking at your hands, but if you're just dreaming that, then you're not. So all these particulars of your mind's representation of the world are not true. So this is a more serious skeptical worry, and it's come to be known in the literature on the external world problem as the dreaming argument. The basic structure of the argument, to paraphrase what Descartes says in a somewhat more long-winded way, if I can put it concisely, the basic structure of the argument would be, premise one, if I cannot know that I'm not dreaming, then I cannot know O, where O just stands for any piece of ordinary perceptual knowledge. Say, for example, I have hands. I take myself to know that I have hands because I can see them. Here again, that would be an example of a belief that I have on the basis of perception. I believe that I have hands because I can see them. But if I do not have hands and I'm dreaming that I do, then I would be seeing them in that case as well. I would be seeing them in the dream. So if I cannot know that I'm not dreaming, then I do not know that I have hands. Any of the ways that we take the world to be on the basis of perception would seem that way in the dream. Could just as easily seem that way in a dream state. But if I'm dreaming, then all of these details may well be false. So if I cannot know that I'm not dreaming, then I cannot know that I have hands. If I cannot know that not D, where D stands for I am dreaming, if I cannot know that not D, then I cannot know O, where O stands for any piece of ordinary perceptual knowledge. Second premise, I cannot know that I'm not dreaming. For any evidence that you could point to and say, in virtue of this, I know that I'm not dreaming, Descartes says, the world could seem to you to be that way. It would seem to you that way if you were dreaming. So here again, what can you point to? Well, I can see my hands. Well, if you were dreaming that you had hands, then you would be seeing your hands. I can feel the warmth of the fire. Well, if you were having a dream that you were standing next to a fire, you would be feeling the warmth of the fire in the dream. So any way that anything that you can point to, let me put it this way, anything that you can point to in the content of experience, the world would seem that way if you were dreaming that. So there's nothing that you can point to in the content of experience such that you know that you're not dreaming. There's no way to rule out the possibility that you're dreaming. How would you rule it out? For anything that you could point to, the world would seem that way if you were dreaming. So you can't rule out the possibility that you're dreaming. That's Descartes' argument. Those are the first two, those are the premises. If I cannot know that I'm not dreaming, then I cannot know any of the things that I take myself to know on the basis of perception. If I cannot know that I'm not dreaming, I cannot know, for example, that I have hands. And I cannot know that I'm not dreaming. Therefore, I cannot know that I have hands. Well, the form of the argument is modus ponens. It's of the form of P then Q, but not Q. If P then Q, P, therefore Q. Where P and Q are variables, P stands for the simple statement, I cannot know that I'm not dreaming. Q stands for the simple statement, I cannot know O. So the form of the argument is if P then Q. Second premise is P. Conclusion, therefore, Q. So it's a basic form of deductive inference. It's called modus ponens. First premise is a conditional statement. Second premise is the antecedent of the conditional. The conclusion of the argument is the consequent of the conditional. Any argument of that form is valid. That's a valid form of inference. And again, by a valid form of deductive inference, what I mean is that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. So modus ponens is a valid form of inference, and these premises appear to be true. Let's take, again, premise one, the conditional statement. If I cannot know that I'm not dreaming, then I cannot know then any of the things that I take myself to know on the basis of perception. If I cannot know that not D, then I cannot know O. That appears to be true. Because if you're just dreaming O, then you don't know it. So that's true. Second premise, I can't know that I'm not dreaming. That appears to be true. For anything that you can point to in the content of experience, oh, I see my hands. Oh, I feel the warmth of the fire. Well, if you were dreaming that, then the world would seem that way to you. So you can't rule out the possibility that you're dreaming. Premise 2 appears to be true as well. The premises appear to be true, and the argument is valid. Therefore, the conclusion is necessarily true. You do not know any of the things that you take yourself to know on the basis of perception. You do not know, for example, that you have hands. That's a surprising outcome, isn't it? And yet it's hard to see how to get around it. The argument is valid and the premises are true, so the conclusion is necessarily true. It's hard to see how to avoid this conclusion. So the dreaming argument does raise a serious skeptical worry. Do we really know anything? And it's inspired, the dreaming argument in Descartes' Meditations has inspired any number of similar arguments, any number of science fiction type scenarios that dramatize basically the same epistemological problem. There are any number of skeptical hypotheses that have been developed that basically take off from this same scenario that Descartes began with in the Meditations. One skeptical hypothesis might be I'm dreaming, but another skeptical hypothesis might be I'm in the Matrix. Here again, this kind of science fiction scenario. Matrix, a series of films in which people think that they're in a world, but the way that the world appears to them is a kind of systematic deception. The world is nothing like what they take it to be. They're actually just plugged into a computer that is simulating all kinds of experiences, but they're not actually having the experiences. So that would be a scenario in which, the Matrix scenario would be a scenario in which reality is radically different from what we take it to be. There's a kind of systematic deception involved. Another skeptical hypothesis would be I'm a brain in a vat. You take yourself to have a body and to be walking around in the world and having all these perceptual experiences. But in point of fact, what's actually going on is that you have no body. You're a disembodied brain being kept alive in a solution in a laboratory. And brain scientists, researchers are stimulating the brain in such a way as to trigger all kinds of perceptions, but none of the perceptions accurately reflect the way that reality is, because you don't even have a body. You're a disembodied brain. The brain can be manipulated in this way. It's possible to perform brain surgery with a local anesthetic so that patients are conscious during the surgery. And many patients report that they're having all kinds of perceptual experiences because of various ways that the brain is being manipulated in the course of the surgery. So subjects undergoing this kind of surgery in which they're conscious and the brain surgeon is manipulating their brain in various ways. They will report, for example, that they're inhaling the aroma of oranges, something like that. Well, there aren't any oranges in the operating room, obviously. Perceptual experiences can be triggered in this way just by manipulating the brain. So how do you know that here again, all the details of your mind's representation of the world, how do you know that they're true if in this scenario all those details would seem to be the case, but that's a kind of systematic deception. You don't have a body at all. You're not walking around in the world at all. You're actually just a disembodied brain having certain kinds of apparent perceptions stimulated in you in an artificial way. That would be another kind of skeptical hypothesis. So all of these latter-day science fiction type scenarios, well, in that last example that I gave, it's not entirely science fiction. I just mentioned an actual case. And there are other such cases like that in the literature. All these skeptical hypotheses basically play the same role in arguments for skepticism about our knowledge of an external world. The basic structure of the argument is the same. If I cannot know that not H, then I cannot know that O, where now H stands for any skeptical hypothesis. Could be I'm dreaming, could be I'm in the matrix, could be I'm just a brain in a vat. But the structure of the argument is basically the same. And the kind of classic version of the argument is Descartes' dreaming argument. Descartes' Meditations is kind of the classical point of departure for this discussion. If I cannot know that not H, then I cannot know that O. I cannot know that not H. Here again, you can't know that you're not dreaming. You can't know that you're not in the matrix. You can't know that you're not a brain in a vat, because for anything that you could point to in the content of your experience, the world would seem that way to you if you were in this skeptical scenario. If this skeptical hypothesis were true, the world would seem to you that way. It seems to you that you have hands, but if you don't, if you're a handless body plugged into the matrix computer, it would seem to you that way because the matrix is programming into that experience in a virtual way. But it's not real. In point of fact, your body doesn't have any hands. Or here again, if you were a brain in a vat, the same would be true. So for any piece of ordinary perceptual knowledge that you can point to, the world would seem that way if you were dreaming. It would seem that way if you were in the matrix. It could well seem that way if you were a brain in a vat. But in all those scenarios, you do not know what you take yourself to know. So the second level of skeptical doubt, the dreaming scenario, represents a real skeptical worry. There are no definitive signs, Descartes says, by which to distinguish being awake from being asleep. So that's his justification here again for premise 2. There are no definitive signs by which to distinguish being awake from being asleep. That's why he takes premise 2 to be true. I cannot know that I'm not dreaming. I can't rule out the possibility that I'm dreaming. Because there aren't any definitive signs to distinguish being awake from dreaming. Well, the second level skeptical hypothesis does not, however, prove sufficiently radical for Descartes' purpose, for Descartes' foundationalist purpose. Here again, the foundationalist purpose is to identify indubitable, certain first principles of knowledge. And here again, those are going to be the principles that survive the most radical skeptical hypothesis that he can devise. But the dreaming scenario is still not sufficiently radical for Descartes' purpose. It's not sufficiently radical because there would still be things, even if you're dreaming, there would still be things that you know. So dreaming does not generate skeptical doubt about general knowledge of an external world. You may be wrong about any particular detail of the mind's representation of the world, but you would still have general knowledge of that there is a world external to your mind, for a few reasons that Descartes gives. Even if I can't rule out the possibility that I'm dreaming, and even if all the particular details of my mind's representation of the world are false, nevertheless, Descartes says, it surely must be admitted that the things seen during slumber are, as it were, like painted images which could only have been produced in the likeness of true things, and that therefore at least these general things, eyes, head, hands, and the whole body, are not imaginary things, but are true and exist. So I do not know that I have hands, for example, but I do know I have good reason to believe. I can be confident that there are such things as hands. The fact that we have a distinction at all between dreaming experience and conscious experience suggests that at least the content of dreams, at least in a general way, the content of dreams comes from conscious experience. So we would still have general knowledge. We can still be confident that there are such things as hands, even if the particular details of my mind's representation of the world may be false. It may be false that I have hands, but I can still be confident that there are such things as hands. So I would still have some general knowledge of the world, even if I can't rule out the possibility that I'm dreaming. So the dreaming scenario proves the second level skeptical hypothesis. The dreaming scenario proves not to be sufficiently radical for Descartes' purposes. We see all kinds of things in dreams that aren't real. But as Descartes points out, at least the elements of those things, we can be confident that at least the elements of those things, even if they're fictional, imaginary things, at least the most basic elements come from conscious experience. For indeed, when painters themselves wish to represent sirens and satyrs, so these are mythological creatures, right, by means of especially bizarre forms, they surely cannot assign them utterly new natures. Rather, they simply fuse together the members of various animals. So, of course, in dreams, in myths, in fairy tales, fantastic stories, what have you, of course, we see all kinds of things that aren't real. But even the bizarre creatures of imagination are not utterly new natures, as Descartes puts it here. So, for example, there's no such thing as a satyr, this mythological creature that is half man, half goat. But there are such things as men, at least the elements of a satyr are real. There are such things as men. There isn't a man who has goat legs, but there are such things as goats and goat legs. There isn't a man who has goat horns, but there are such things as goat horns. So what happens in dreams, as Descartes points out, is that we take the basic elements of conscious experience and simply fuse them together in different fantastic, strictly imaginary ways. Okay, so even if dreaming scenario were true, there would still be things that we know, even if there are no satyrs, at least the elements of satyrs, goats and men and horns and hooves, at least the elements of those fantastic things exist. Or say, for example, a unicorn. Maybe you see a unicorn in a dream. Well, there isn't any such thing as a unicorn, but of course, here again, a mythological creature that is a horse with a horn sticking out of its head. Well, there are such things as horses, and there are such things as horns. So in dream experience, we simply recombine, we simply fuse together in new combinations the elements of those things that we directly experience in conscious awareness. So we would still have some general knowledge even if we are dreaming. And Descartes goes to observe that whether I'm awake or asleep, 2 plus 3 make 5, and a square does not have more than 4 sides, so mathematical truth remains the same even if you're dreaming. So knowledge in arithmetic, knowledge in geometry, this would still be the same. In fact, some mathematicians report that they have solved problems in their dreams, so presumably mathematical thinking, even in your dreams, remains the same. even if the skeptical hypothesis were true, there would still be propositions that I know. I would still know that 2 plus 3 make 5. I would still know that a square cannot have more than 4 sides. That is to say, I would still know certain a priori truths, truths that, here again, do not depend on experience. 2 plus 3 make 5 is, here again, an a priori truth. It doesn't depend on experience. You simply see in a direct way, you simply intuit, you simply have an immediate direct awareness of the truth of that proposition. Once you're able, of course, once you have sufficient mental maturity, once you're old enough to entertain the abstract proposition that's involved in arithmetic knowledge. Of course, maybe we originally come to see the truth of a proposition like that by taking 2 blocks and 3 blocks and putting them together and see that they make 5. Or doing the same thing with 2 marbles and 3 marbles, something like that. Maybe that's how we first come to understand the truth of certain arithmetic propositions. But the truth of the proposition doesn't depend on that empirical procedure. It could have been anything. And of course, once you advance to larger numbers, that way of coming to see the truth of the proposition isn't any longer practically possible. So knowledge in arithmetic is a priori. It doesn't depend on experience. Although certain experiences bring us to see the truth of a proposition, the truth of the proposition itself doesn't depend on any empirical procedure. You don't have to go on testing that proposition. Let's see if it works with blocks. Let's see if it works with marbles. Let's see if it works with coffee mugs. Let's see if it works with beer cans, and so forth and so on. There isn't a kind of empirical procedure that you have to go through to verify that proposition, is there? You just do see the truth of it. A square cannot have more than 4 sides. Here again, there isn't any empirical procedure that you have to go through to verify the truth of that proposition. It's a kind of conceptual truth. It's an a priori truth. It doesn't depend on an empirical procedure. It doesn't depend on experience or observation for its truth. So even if the skeptical hypothesis were true, there would still be propositions that I know. I would still have a priori knowledge. And Descartes says I would still know the simplest elements of corporeal nature in general. That is to say, bodily nature in general. Corporeal means bodily, having to do with bodies. For example, that every body has some extension. That is to say, every body is spread out in space. Every body has some shape. Every body has some size. So we would still have general knowledge about the basic nature of body. Here again, a body by way of contrast with something like a point in geometry. A point in geometry has no extension. A point has no parts. By way of contrast, a body is something that is spread out in space, something that occupies space, something that is extended into space. So that's a basic element of any body. Any body must have some shape. Every body must have some size. These, at least the basic, even if I'm wrong about the particular details of my mind's representation of the world, there is no such thing as a unicorn, say, for example. Still, that a unicorn has a certain shape, a certain size, occupies a certain region of space, all these things would still be true of it in virtue of its being a body, whether the body that I'm seeing is an imaginary body, a dream body, or a real body. Even if the things in dreams are only images of composite bodies, bodies still must be composed of certain properties, even in dreams, such as, here again, size, shape, extension. So there would still be things that I know. Even if I can't rule out the possibility that I'm dreaming, there would still be things that I know. I would still have certain general knowledge about the world, and I would still have a priori knowledge. Okay, so Descartes moves up to an even more radical skeptical hypothesis. The third level of skeptical doubt is known as the evil genius hypothesis, or the evil genius scenario. So in the first unit of the course, we saw Descartes' version of the ontological argument. We saw that God believes in God as traditionally conceived. That is to say, God is conceived by Aquinas, by Samuel Clarke. The God that is omnipotent, that is to say, can do anything, and omniscient, that is to say, knows everything, and is supremely good. The traditional conception of God in the Western philosophical tradition, and for that matter in the Western religious traditions, the Judeo-Christian religious tradition as well. We saw in the first unit of the course that Descartes believes in God conceived in that way. We saw his version of the ontological argument for God's existence. But here again, in the Meditations, he's trying to devise the most radical skeptical hypothesis that he can conceive. So he takes that concept of God and he revises it. What if instead of an omnipotent, supremely good being, what if there were an omnipotent evil being? And so this being is omnipotent, that is to say, can do everything, is supremely powerful, and omniscient, is supremely clever, but instead of being good is intent upon deceiving me in a total and a systematic way. This evil genius is foisting upon me a kind of total delusion, a kind of total deception, a systematic deception. Everything that I believe in is false. Okay, now this is a more serious skeptical worry, isn't it? Because if there is an omnipotent being that is bent upon deceiving me, then that being could certainly bring it about that I'm, in virtue of here again being omnipotent, able to do anything, would be able to bring it about that all of my beliefs are false. So now there's a real skeptical worry, isn't it? That none of my beliefs are true. In a dreaming scenario, there would still be certain things that I know. In this scenario, everything that I take myself to know is false. That's the skeptical worry. Descartes says, I will suppose not a supremely good God, the source of truth, but rather an evil genius, supremely powerful and clever, who has directed his entire effort at deceiving me. And again, if this being is omnipotent, then presumably in virtue of his being all-powerful, it would be a total deception. All of my beliefs would be false. So in dreaming scenario, at least I still knew that there is a world composed of things like bodies. But the evil genius hypothesis generates skeptical doubt about our knowledge that there even is a world external to our minds. Perhaps there is no world at all. My representation of there being a world is again a kind of systematic delusion, a kind of systematic total deception. There is no world external to minds. Descartes says, I suppose now that everything I see is false. I believe that none of what my deceitful memory represents ever existed. I have no senses whatever. Body, shape, extension, movement, and place are all chimeras. Chimera was a byword in the 17th century for anything that is just totally imaginary, totally fanciful, strictly just purely imaginary. So chimera is the name of a mythological creature here again. It was the mythological creature that had a lion's body, a snake for a tail, and a goat's head growing out of the middle of its back. So it was a kind of mythological creature, but it just became a kind of phrase, a kind of, kind of word, I should say, a kind of byword for any kind of just completely fantastic, completely imaginary thing. So in dreaming scenario, even if I was wrong about the particular details of this or that body, this in my mind's representation of the world, I could at least be confident that there are such things as bodies. But at the third level of skeptical doubt, in the third level skeptical scenario, on this third level skeptical hypothesis, now I do not even know that there are such things as bodies, because omnipotent evil being is foisting upon me here again a total systematic deception. All my beliefs are false. I have persuaded myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Is it then the case that I too do not exist? But doubtless I did exist if I persuaded myself of something. So now Descartes is coming to the first principle of knowledge, the knowledge that even in this most radical skeptical scenario still cannot be doubted. Even if all of my other beliefs are false. I believe there's such a thing as the sky, but here again in this evil genius scenario there is no sky. I believe there's such a thing as earth, but in this skeptical scenario there is no earth. I believe that there are bodies, but in this radical evil genius deception, here again, that's not true. There's no such thing as bodies. The omnipotent being is just bringing it about that I believe there are such things as bodies. And here again, in virtue of omnipotence, it seems like the being would be able to bring that about. Would be able to bring about that all of these beliefs are false. But do I therefore know nothing at all? Well, as Descartes says, doubtless I exist if I persuaded myself of something. That is to say, if I've even persuaded myself that I don't know there's any such thing as the sky or the earth or bodies, I have to exist to persuade myself of those claims. So here we run up against something that cannot be doubted. It cannot coherently be doubted. You cannot doubt your own existence. It would be self-defeating to try to doubt your own existence. There would have to be something doing the doubting in the first place. So this ends up being the fulcrum. This ends up being the foundational principle. This ends up being the first principle. A principle that even on the most radical skeptical hypothesis, you couldn't be wrong about. Let him do his best at deception, that is to say, the evil genius. Let him do his best at deception. He will never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall think that I am something. So the certain first principle of knowledge is knowledge of your own existence. This pronouncement, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it. So there's no getting around the fact that you exist. Even if all your other beliefs are false, here again you would have to exist in the first place to have false beliefs. If I doubt that I doubt, I thereby affirm that I doubt. That is to say, there must be something doing the doubting. So even if all my other beliefs are false, I would have to exist in the first place to have false beliefs. Even if I am caught up in a total deception, a total systematic deception, still I would have to exist in order to be deceived. So this is the first principle of knowledge, one's own existence. It's come to be known in the literature on Descartes by this Latin phrase that uses cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So long as I'm thinking, there's no getting around the fact that I exist. There has to be something doing the thinking. And of course, doubting is one variety of thinking. So long as I'm doubting my existence, here again, I have to exist in order to doubt. So long as I'm entertaining the possibility that my mental representation of the world is completely false, here again, I would have to exist to be subjected to this total deception. So there's no getting around the fact that I exist. So the first principle of knowledge, here again, we're getting into an epistemological issue in Descartes' meditations. Not only are we looking at the metaphysical question, what is the relation between the mind and the world, but the epistemological question, what is the foundation for my beliefs about that world? The first principle, or the first foundational principle of that knowledge, is knowledge of one's own existence. So at this point in the meditations, Descartes has established the truth of his own existence. So the next question that arises is this metaphysical question, what am I? What is this I that thinks? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What is this I that thinks? That is to say, what is the self? What am I is the next philosophical question. So next we get Descartes' account of personal identity. And here again, this is a big metaphysical question. What am I? What is the self? What is a person? What is a self? Well, in reflecting on his progression here, from skeptical doubt to first principles of knowledge, he reflects that the self is thinking substance. He asks, what am I? Well, a thing that thinks, a thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and that also imagines and senses. So this is the first thing that we know about ourselves, namely that we think, and that we go through all these different mental states. Doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, believing, refusing, imagining, sensing. We can be certain that we do go through all of these mental states. If I'm affirming my belief in the world, then here again, I can't be wrong that I am affirming that, even if the belief itself in the world is false, that I am affirming it. I can't be wrong about that. Or that I am denying the existence of such a world. Here again, even if that denial is wrong, I can't be wrong that I am denying the existence of a mind-independent external world. So here again, here's something that we can't be wrong about. You cannot coherently doubt that you think. So that the self is thinking substance is another of these first principles of knowledge, another of these foundational principles of knowledge. So this term substance is an old term in the history of metaphysics. It goes back to Aristotle. In the most general metaphysical sense, it's just the idea of that which persists through changes. Or to put the point another way, that which properties are in, that in which properties inhere. So when you hear the term substance, you might first think of material substance, familiar substances in the physical world around us, like water or something like that. But thinking substance obviously is not material substance. Material substance would be the different kinds of physical stuffs that are presented to us in perception, but those things don't think. But on the other hand, there is something that persists through all these different mental states. I'm a thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, imagines, senses. How do I know that there is something in each of those different mental states that is the same thing, persisting through all those changes of mental state? Well, here again, that I am what persists through all those changes is indubitable, is certain. And so what I am essentially is thinking substance, that is to say, something that persists through all these changes. So substance in the broadest metaphysical sense is just that which persists through changes. That in which properties inhere. All these mental states, doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, refusing, imagining, sensing, what are all of those mental states in? Mental states don't just float around unattached to anything, right? What are they in? They have to be in a substance. That is to say, they have to be in something that persists through all of those changes, something that exists independently of all those mental states. What I am essentially is something that exists independently of affirming, denying, willing, because those mental states change, but there is something, namely me, that they're in, myself, my mind. my thinking substance, the thinking substance that I am, I should say. It's not thinking substance is what you are, not something that you have. My thinking substance, my spiritual the thinking substance that I am, the spiritual substance that I am. That's what persists through all these changes. So the word substance comes from the Latin word subtare, to support. The idea of it is the support or the basis. To use another metaphysical term, the substratum that all those properties are in. In the case of spiritual substance or thinking substance, the properties would be the different mental states that we go through. Doubting, understanding, affirming, denying, willing, refusing, imagining, sensing, believing. All these are properties of, but what are the properties in? They have to be in something. Beliefs don't just float around unattached to anything. What they're in is me, namely a thinking substance, a spiritual substance.